Okay, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Gianluca Brunori. I'm a professor of food policy at the University of Pisa. And in this webinar, I would like to illustrate a synthesis of the work of the conceptual framework of moving that a group of us, including Michele Moretti, Stefano Grando, Francesco Felici, Vano Scotti, Tarek Alali, Corrado Jevoli, and Angelo Belligiano have done so far. So let's start. I think it is important for people who haven't followed moving just to give a very brief description of what moving is. Moving means mountain valorization through interconnectedness and green growth, and is a 4-year project gathering 23 partners and coordinated by the University of Cordoba, Spain. The project is funded by the Horizon 2020 project. The project main objective is to build capacity and co-develop relevant policy frameworks across Europe for the establishment of value chains that contribute to the resilience and sustainability of mountain areas to climate change. So this objective is very important for our conceptual framework because we will try to unpack these terms that are mentioned in the objective. Just to let you know how the moving structure is shaped, we start from creating a conceptual base, and on this conceptual base we develop some tools for analysis, and then we start with an inventory of 400 value chains across Europe. Then we select 23 case studies that we will analyze in depth, and then we will make a cross-case comparison and trying to understand what are the value chains potential. And then we will have a foresight exercise to envisage future perspective. All of these actions are, let's say, ended by an in-depth policy analysis and roadmap. And in the meanwhile, we also have a policy audit, so trying to understand how policies are carried out at different levels and to identify new or updated policies. So I will start with the main concepts that we will use in moving. The first concept is socio-ecological systems. We want, as I mentioned before, to see what could be the contribution of value chains to sustainability and resilience of mountain areas. And this means that we have to understand the mountain areas as systems, and especially as a socio-ecological system, stressing the importance of ecological aspects, but also of how the society of mountain areas interacts and affect the management of natural resources. And in this way, socio-ecological systems, which is a concept taken from Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize for economics, are defined as complex, interdependent, and linked systems of people and nature, which are nested across scales. So what is a socio-ecological system? It can, as you can see in the picture, represented by 5 elements. The first elements are the resource units. For example, water or a lake is a resource unit. And these resource units are linked to resource systems. So a lake is related to the water systems that feed the lake, etc. And who is regulating the use of water? The regulation of the use of water is related to governance systems. And but who use the resource, for example, water? There are actors. So, for example, fishermen, people who drink water, people who have to irrigate, etc. So these are actors that have an interest in resources, and they affect the use of resources. So all these four elements interact together in what we call focal action situations. So, for example, actors interact with the resource units. For example, they pump water, and they affect the levels of water, the quality of water, etc. And this action is regulated by governance systems. And these systems, depending on the type of interaction, gives different outcomes. And these outcomes are measured in terms of sustainability and resilience. So this is the first concept. The second concept is value chain. The project is about value chains, but we want to look at the sustainable value chains, and especially value chains that improve the conditions of rural areas. So we can define value chains as the network of actors and activities geographically localized that through upstream and downstream linkages provide the consumer with a product or services, obtaining in exchange a value to be distributed between the components of the chain. So as you can see here, there are farmers connected in different ways among each other. They link to processors, processor links to retailers, retailers link to public authorities, citizens, consumers, etc. And through these different networks, we can see interfaces. So there are, let's say, ways of communicating between different actors and different networks of actors. So the third step of our conceptual framework is to put together these two aspects, so socio-ecological systems and value chains. What is linking together these two concepts? How value chains are related to socio-ecological system? We start from the observation that everything is related to what we call practices. So practices are activities that have an interaction with resource units, but they are carried out by actors, and these actors are regulated by governance systems. And these practices have a given set of outcomes, and especially related to sustainability and resilience. So for us, and you see in red the character of practices, practices are the key to understand the link between value chains and socio-ecological system in mountain areas. Why we do this, this representation? Because we believe that in mountain areas, one of the key aspects for development is resource management, and especially natural resource management, that we know that in mountain areas are fragile, but at the same time are really a source of value. But the problem is that if you exploit them too much, so if you overexploit, in the end, you will make mountain areas more fragile. And then value chains should be, let's say, attentive to not to overexploit the natural resources of mountain areas, and at the same time give more value to mountain areas. So for this reason, value chains, you can see here in the picture at the interface between governance system and resource system, because good value chains could give value to the region through a valorization of resource system. Bad value chains can overexploit and decrease the sustainability and the resilience of these regions. So in order to make it less theoretical and more practical, let's start from an example. The picture you see in the left is Agnone, is a small village in the mountains of southern internal areas of Italy. And the main product is the cheese you can see in the right. The name in Italian is caciocavallo. It's a typical product. So a lot of people know this kind of cheese is very well known. But then this cheese can be produced in different ways. So it can be a component of a number of different types of value chains. So we have, for example, one type of value chain that in which the production of this cheese is done with local milk, and this local milk is produced by local sheep who go and graze in local pastures. So most of the resources necessary to produce this cheese are taken from the region. And actually this makes a high quality milk. And the actors are very keen in using local resources and communicating this value of the local resources to the outside. So if we want to represent this value chain in terms of the socio-ecological system, this rectangular figure in green is a socio-ecological system. You can see here research unit, resource systems, governance system, and actors. And they interact together to produce this local cheese. But of course, this local cheese is sold outside the region because they produce it, it's quite renowned. So there are people outside the region who want to pay a higher price for this product. And also tourists visiting the area are attracted by this quality cheese. But another way to produce this cheese is what we call value chain 2. In this case, especially because there is a lot of demand of this cheese, local producers have started to buy milk from the outside. So they don't purchase local milk, also because it's relatively scarce and they want to produce higher quantities. And so they buy raw milk from the outside. And at the same time, they send not to tourists or, let's say, individual consumers, but they sell to large retailers, and large retailers then sell to consumers market. What you can see here is a tendency to detach the production, so the practice of producing meals, from local resources and local governance systems. In this case, the governance system of the production of this cheese is mainly based on large retailers, because they have quite a big power in the value chain. So this is very much in synthesis the conceptual framework of moving. But then, how do we use this conceptual framework? On this regard, we have identified 10 propositions for the development and the application of the conceptual framework. The first proposition is related to practices. We have said that practices are central in our conceptual framework. And actually, our statement is that local actors engage in social practices with resource units and with other actors. So when we go and analyze value chains in the mountains, we want to start from the resources that are typical for the mountain, and the practices that are carried out with these resources. And in this case, we analyze the resource units, local actors, and also other actors that may have an influence on these practices. And thus, this is the first statement. The second statement is the purpose of these practices. What are these practices carried out for? Practices are aimed at the creation and distribution of value. Value is another very important aspect of our conceptual framework. And the amount of value that actors are able to create is affected by the resource system of the area, which constitute the territorial capital. So what we want to say is that we have a socio-ecological system with its peculiarity. And these peculiarities are affecting the value that can be created. So in this case, you can see in the scheme that the value depends on the characteristics of the resource systems and on the practices that are carried out in the system. You may know, for example, that a given area is a tourist attraction, a tourist destination, because of its landscape. And the landscape, for example, is a system related to the resources, and it is based on natural resources as well as cultural resources, because it is the production of historical, let's say, stratification of practices. So this is the second statement. The third statement is that social practices are developed within actors' relational space. And so they are affected by normative, cognitive, and technical system of rules. Those, for example, that characterize social norm or technological pathways. So we have practices, and these practices are affected by rules, and rules are let's say, linked together in governance systems, because a governance system is based on a network of different and interlinked rules. And among the rules that regulate practices, there are the ones generated by governance systems. So the fourth statement is related to value chains. For us, it is important to see how value chains evolve, how local actors lead value chains. And so they are really something that it's changing continuously in our approach. So we can say that actors interact with other actors to connect to existing value chains or to establish new value chains. So we have seen before, for example, that the two value chains we have seen in the Agnone case study are the product of different strategies of two different local actors. One considering links to the local resources, local consumers, tourists, and individual consumers outside, and the other one linking together the production to external milk, but also with retailers or large retailers. So they have shaped different types of relational patterns. The fifth statement is that business activities can be seen as a continuous flow of connection, disconnection of practices. And so value chains can be seen as assemblages of practices. In this figure, you can see two actors, one having two practices in their business unit, practice A and practice C, and actor two having other two practices. But these practices can combine themselves in different value chains. So if you can see, actor one belong both to value chain A through it goes through value chain B, but for example, actor two can go to another value chain through practice B. So this means that there is a kind of flexibility, and it is good to see these connections that actors try to activate in order to survive or to improve their business. So how these practices evolve? Our statement here is that practices can evolve in relation to the connections with other practices. And so, for example, here you have two actors, two practices, and one value chain. But suppose that in the value chains, another practice is added. So this practice, for example, a step in the processing of milk, for example, filtering, can be considered one additional practice, shapes in a different way also the other practices, so practice B and practice C. So you can see in the end a different set of practice, because B changes to adapt to the new practice, and C adapts to the new practices. And then the new B, the new C, and D compose the value chain A. So it is important to see this continuous evolution, because we have to consider how these activities linked together can create value. So what affects assemblages? So we introduce another level of analysis, which is the business model. Why the dairy one in Agnone behaves differently from dairy two? Because they have different business models, and they want to create value in different ways. One stressing on the use of local resources, the other one stressing on big markets and exporting, for example. And this means that they create different patterns of practices and different connections with different types of value chains. But another aspect that is very important to our research is that what happens at the level of one socio-ecological system, it has repercussions on other socio-ecological systems. As value chains have flows of materials from one region to another, in the end, the impact you can see on one region can be generated by other regions. And for this reason, it is important to address the issue of, let's say, the impact of value. So in this picture, you see the connections that a value chain, you can see it in red, are created by different socio-ecological systems. And this is important because, as we said before, montane areas are the most fragile in the chains of socio-ecological systems. So sometimes, for example, they are the powerless actor or the powerless region in the systems of the links between urban and rural. So it is important on this regard to see how the resource management at one level affect the other levels, or vice versa. What are the situations in, for example, urban socio-ecological systems on mountain areas? The ninth statement is that through these connections, value chains can influence different socio-ecological systems. So in our methodology, we try to detect the outcomes that at each level can be generated, but also considering not only the outcomes at the local level, but also the outcome of at a distance level. We call, in this case, about telecoupling. So something that gives effects at a distance. And sometimes for sustainability assessment, we have to consider also the distant effects, sometimes in terms of let's say, global effects or, let's say, effects overseas, because what the behavior at one point may produce is big effects at other points in other regions. So as the last statement is that the value chains that contribute to sustainable and resilient mountain areas need conducive policy environments. So we start from the hypothesis that value chains can be affected, local policies, but also regional policies and European policies can influence the behavior of value chains. How? Through conducive policy environments that help local actors to connect with the right value chains, or also to be more, let's say, powerful in the relations between and within the value chains. So given that, we can say that we may assess the different conduciveness of different types of policy environments. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening.